In the winter of 1830, Poland stood at the heart of Europe, caught between the shadow of Russia and the silence of the West. Warsaw erupted when young Polish officers rose against the Tsar, defying one of the most powerful empires on earth. France and Britain watched, but offered no hand. For months, the Poles fought with courage, believing independence could be reclaimed. Yet the Russian Empire moved relentlessly, determined to crush the rebellion. What followed was not just the defeat of an army, but the breaking of a nation's fragile dream, a lesson Europe would not forget. The year was 1830 and Europe seemed stable on the surface, yet beneath the treaties and royal decrees, discontent simmered. Poland, bound within the so-called Kingdom of Congress, remained under the heavy hand of the Russian Tsar. The promises of autonomy made after the Congress of Vienna had already withered into hollow words. Russian officials dictated laws, censored newspapers, and reminded the Poles at every turn that their freedom was only tolerated, never respected. In Warsaw, whispers turned into plans, and plans into a decision that would soon challenge the empire's might. Young officers of the Polish army were the first to act, men who had been raised on stories of independence and humiliation alike. They gathered in secret, convinced that silence was no longer possible. Among them was Piotr Wysoki, a determined lieutenant whose fiery words ignited restless cadets. One whispered, "Tonight we rise or we remain slaves forever." The room answered with silence at first, then nods of grim agreement. It was not a matter of victory, it was a matter of dignity, and dignity could not wait. On the night of November 29th, Warsavians heard gunfire and saw torches blazing against the cold sky. The cadets stormed the Belvedere Palace, where the hated Grand Duke Constantine resided as the Tsar's representative. Though they failed to capture him, the act itself became a declaration to the world. Poland would not accept the chain without struggle. Crowds surged into the streets, tearing down Russian symbols, shouting for freedom. For the first time in years, Warsaw pulsed with the spirit of rebellion, as if the city itself had awakened from a long nightmare. The uprising spread quickly, for the Polish people carried resentment like dry wood, awaiting a single spark. Farmers from nearby villages entered the city, bearing tools and scythes as weapons. Students abandoned their books, artisans their workshops, and soon the Polish forces swelled with volunteers. Mothers whispered blessings while sons marched with little more than determination. Yet, in every cheer, echoed a question left unspoken. Would the great powers of Europe recognize this cry? Or would France and Britain, weary from their own affairs, let Poland stand alone once more? News of the rebellion reached St. Petersburg within days, and the Tsar's wrath was immediate. Nicholas I ordered his generals to march west with overwhelming force. He laughed at reports of students and farmers wielding makeshift arms, yet he knew better than to underestimate desperation. While Warsaw celebrated its brief liberation, the Russian war machine was already moving. One Polish commander admitted bitterly, "We have raised the sword against a giant." But no one among the rebels spoke of surrender, for they believed a crushed rebellion was still better than a silent life under tyranny. As winter deepened, the lines between courage and despair blurred. Polish leaders debated strategy, torn between bold offensives and cautious defenses. The people demanded action, unwilling to wait for Europe's approval. The rebellion had become more than a military act. It was a statement that Poland still lived, even in chains. The city stood defiant, knowing the Russian armies were approaching, step by step, like an iron tide. The streets of Warsaw trembled with anticipation, as if the stones themselves awaited the reckoning that would soon descend upon them. The first rush of triumph in Warsaw soon gave way to a darker realization. The rebels had seized the moment, but they had not yet secured the future. As the smoke of the November night cleared, the city was both liberated and vulnerable, its streets filled with fervor but lacking order. Leaders emerged hastily, arguing over whether to form a provisional government, whether to reach out to Europe, whether to march against the Russian garrisons that still lingered nearby. The uprising had given Poland a voice again, but the question was whether it would speak in unity or dissolve in discord. In hastily convened councils, aristocrats and generals clashed with students and cadets. Some demanded immediate declarations of independence, while others counseled patience, fearing that Europe would abandon them if the rebellion appeared reckless. A young officer raised his voice. "France will come. They cannot ignore this." The reply came coldly from an older noble. "France does not bleed for Poland." The silence that followed revealed the grim truth. The nation's fate would not be decided in Paris or London, but in Warsaw's own streets and on the fields where Russian soldiers already gathered. Meanwhile, Grand Duke Constantine, though spared from capture, felt the walls closing in. Hunted in the capital, he slipped away under cover of night, retreating with loyal Russian troops toward the east. His escape was both a relief and a curse for the rebels. They had rid Warsaw of the Tsar's hand, but in doing so they allowed him to summon reinforcements. The Tsar's fury would not be delayed. News of Constantine's flight reached Nicholas I, who declared that rebellion would be met with absolute destruction. In his words to his generals, "Leave nothing standing that defies Russia." The people of Warsaw responded with determination rather than fear. Barricades rose across the city, crude but resolute, built from wagons, timber, and cobblestones pried from the very streets. Blacksmiths forged weapons overnight, priests blessed the crowds, and mothers whispered courage into the ears of sons who had never held a musket. One student wrote in his diary, "If we are to fall, let it be known that Warsaw stood proud." These words passed from mouth to mouth, a reminder that even defeat could carry a form of immortality when tied to sacrifice. Beyond the city, the rebellion spread across the countryside. Towns declared loyalty to the uprising, and militias formed in the forests and plains. Yet for every village that raised a Polish banner, another fell silent under the advancing Russians. The balance of power was mercilessly clear. Poland could summon courage, but Russia could summon endless men, cannons, and supplies. The rebels dreamed of Europe riding to their aid, but no armies appeared on the horizon. The great powers measured Poland not in ideals but in treaties and convenience, and for them, silence was safer than intervention. As December descended, the first snow fell upon a land already drenched in anxiety. The rebels prepared for the inevitable clash, digging defenses and swearing oaths beneath frozen skies. In candle-lit halls, leaders drafted proclamations that spoke of freedom and dignity, while outside the walls, peasants shivered with weapons that would not pierce Russian steel. The city braced itself for war, the people torn between hope and dread. In every whispered prayer and every clenched fist lingered the same unspoken thought. Russia was coming, and with it, the storm that would decide whether Poland's cry would echo or be silenced forever. Winter settled heavily over Poland as the rebellion deepened into a test of endurance. The initial blaze of enthusiasm had not burned out, but the weight of reality pressed harder with each passing day. Russian troops marched west in disciplined columns, while Polish forces scrambled to transform their passion into organized resistance. The national government formed in Warsaw tried to project authority, yet it remained divided between radicals who sought complete independence and conservatives who whispered of negotiation. Unity was fragile, and every decision carried the shadow of betrayal or hesitation. Amid these divisions, voices rose louder in the chambers of Warsaw. One radical declared, "We fight for freedom, not compromise," a nobleman countered. "Without Europe, our blood will be wasted." The tension in the hall was thick, each word sharpened by fear. Outside, soldiers drilled in icy courtyards, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Citizens watched from doorways torn between pride and dread, knowing that while their leaders argued, Russian cannons drew closer. The fate of the uprising was not only a matter of muskets, but of will, and will was already cracking. The Russian advance was relentless. Columns of infantry pressed through snow and mud, their drums echoing across frozen plains. Villages that resisted were set ablaze, their inhabitants scattered or executed as examples. Refugees poured into Warsaw, carrying tales of atrocities that chilled even the bravest hearts. A woman who had fled from the countryside whispered to a priest, "They came like fire in the night, and there was nothing we could do." Her words spread quickly, reminding all who heard them that the empire was not only vast, but merciless. Yet the Polish spirit did not falter completely. Commanders sought to rally the people by pointing to earlier victories, insisting that courage could tip the balance. Recruitment drives filled city squares, and young men pledged themselves to the cause, even knowing what awaited them. One recruit, barely 17, told his mother, "I will not live to be old if it means living under chains." His words echoed the sentiment of many, for the uprising had become more than a battle. It was an act of defiance, written into the blood of a generation. Inside Warsaw, preparations intensified. Blacksmiths hammered weapons late into the night, women sewed uniforms and tended to the wounded, and children carried water to barricades. The city became both fortress and prison, its people bound together by desperation. Priests preached of sacrifice from pulpits, declaring that God would bless those who gave their lives for the nation. The air itself seemed heavy with foreboding, as if even the walls of Warsaw understood that their stones might soon be shattered by Russian artillery. Every effort, every prayer, was an attempt to buy one more day of freedom. As January approached, hope and dread mingled in equal measure. Rumors swirled of secret appeals sent to France and Britain, though no answers came. Instead, all that arrived was silence from abroad and the distant thunder of enemy guns. The rebels stood ready, clinging to the belief that honor demanded resistance, even in the face of annihilation. The uprising was no longer just a fight for territory, it was a declaration of identity, a refusal to vanish quietly into the empire's shadow. And as the snow fell over Warsaw, the stage was set for the storm to break. By January 1831, the silence before the storm had ended. The Russian Empire, insulted by Poland's defiance, sent its armies westward in full force. General Dibich, a veteran of the Napoleonic Wars, led the campaign with ruthless precision. His soldiers advanced like an iron tide across frozen fields, their banners stiff in the wind, their cannons groaning across the plains. In Warsaw, the news of their approach spread quickly. Fear mingled with determination, for the rebels knew the hour of reckoning had come, and it would be written in fire and blood. The Polish commanders resolved to strike before the enemy reached the capital. They assembled their forces on the outskirts, men armed with muskets, sabers, and a burning conviction that freedom was worth any sacrifice. A young officer declared to his comrades, "We are outnumbered, but not outwilled." His words drew nods but also silence, for all knew that courage alone could not halt Russian columns. Still, hesitation was no longer an option. The first clashes unfolded in villages and forests, where the snow was stained red with blood before vanishing into the earth. Battles erupted with ferocity that shocked both sides. In Grochov, near the Vistula, Polish troops hurled themselves against the Russian lines, charging through smoke and cannon fire. For a moment, it seemed as though raw defiance might hold the empire at bay. A soldier cried, "Warsaw will not fall, not while I breathe." Yet the Russian artillery pounded relentlessly, tearing holes in Polish ranks, scattering men like leaves in a storm. The fields became graveyards, and every victory was paid for with lifetimes cut short. Inside Warsaw, the tension was unbearable. Families waited in candlelit homes, listening for the sound of bells that would signal triumph or disaster. Mothers whispered prayers, children clung to their fathers' uniforms, and priests carried messages to the front lines. One woman, hearing the distant roar of cannons, murmured to her neighbor, "They are killing our sons and we cannot stop it." The city itself seemed to hold its breath, knowing that whatever the outcome, Warsaw's fate was bound to the courage of its defenders. The Russians pressed harder with every passing day. Their numbers swelled, their discipline unbroken, while Polish forces strained under exhaustion and dwindling supplies. Leaders quarreled over strategy, but the men in the trenches had no time for politics. They fought with desperation, wielding bayonets when powder ran low, striking with rage born of humiliation. A peasant conscript shouted as he thrust his blade, "This is for my village, this is for Poland!" His cry vanished in the thunder of musket fire, but his defiance lived on in the hearts of those who heard it. By February, the lines around Warsaw trembled but did not collapse. Against all odds, the Poles had held their ground in several key battles, proving that the empire's might was not invincible. Yet the cost was devastating. Fields littered with corpses, hospitals overflowing, and morale fraying under the relentless pressure. Hope still lingered, fragile and flickering, but it was clear to all that the struggle had only begun. The storm was not passing, it was gathering, and its full force would soon descend upon the nation with merciless clarity. The clash at Grochov did not bring the decisive victory either side desired, but it marked a turning point. For the Poles, survival against overwhelming force was a triumph of will. For the Russians, it was a humiliation that demanded vengeance. General Dibich pushed his soldiers harder, determined to crush resistance swiftly. The snow-covered plains echoed with drums and cannons as armies maneuvered, each battle more ferocious than the last. Warsaw remained under threat, and the city's defenders understood that their stand had only delayed the inevitable confrontation. Polish commanders sought to rally their exhausted troops with both strategy and words. General Czapicki, though cautious by nature, urged unity, declaring to his men, "Poland cannot live if Warsaw falls." His soldiers, bloodied but unbroken, answered with weary determination. They dug trenches, fortified positions, and swore to resist until the last man. Yet beneath the surface, disagreements continued to fester. Some demanded bold offensives, others urged caution, and the fragile unity of the rebellion threatened to fracture under the weight of impossible choices. Despite these divisions, moments of brilliance emerged. At Dębe Wielkie, Polish forces launched a daring assault, breaking through Russian lines and scattering enemy units in confusion. The victory electrified Warsaw, where bells rang and crowds filled the streets in celebration. A soldier shouted to his comrade, "We have shown the world that Poland still breathes." Yet even in triumph, the reality was sobering. Every victory cost lives Poland could not replace, while Russia possessed reserves that seemed endless. The struggle was no longer about individual battles, but about endurance. As spring approached, the land itself turned against the rebels. Melting snow transformed roads into rivers of mud, slowing supply wagons and exhausting soldiers who marched through knee-deep mire. Hunger gnawed at the Polish ranks, and disease began to claim more lives than Russian bullets. In villages along the front, peasants wept as their barns emptied into the war effort, their sacrifices leaving them with little to survive. A farmer whispered bitterly, "We give everything, and still it is not enough." His words captured the growing despair spreading across the countryside. The Russians, relentless in their advance, responded with calculated cruelty. Villages suspected of aiding the rebels were burned, their inhabitants scattered into forests or deported eastward. Captured insurgents faced swift execution, their bodies left as warnings on the roads. The Empire's message was clear: defiance would be answered with annihilation. Polish fighters hardened their resolve in response, declaring that such brutality only deepened their cause. One officer told his unit, "If they burn our homes, then we fight with ashes in our hands." His defiance kept men standing when hope itself seemed fragile. By mid-1831, the rebellion stood at a crossroads. The Poles had proven that they could wound the Empire but not destroy it. Victories inspired pride, yet losses drained the strength of both army and people. Europe still watched in silence, unwilling to risk war with Russia for Poland's sake. In Warsaw, leaders debated their next move, aware that hesitation could be fatal. The uprising was no longer measured only in territory gained or lost, but in the resilience of a nation's spirit, tested against the heaviest storm it had ever endured. Summer of 1831 brought no relief to Poland. The victories of spring had lifted spirits, but the weight of Russia's might pressed harder with every passing week. General Paskevich replaced Dibich after illness claimed the older commander, and with him came renewed determination to end the rebellion at any cost. His columns advanced with ruthless precision, pushing deeper into Polish territory, surrounding towns and choking supply lines. The rebels, exhausted and outnumbered, clung to the belief that one decisive strike might yet turn the tide, even as reality whispered otherwise. Warsaw became a city of preparation and dread. Leaders spoke in crowded halls, struggling to balance hope with harsh truth. One delegate declared, "Europe cannot ignore us forever." Another answered coldly, "Europe has already chosen silence." The arguments echoed through chambers while outside. Families fortified their homes, waiting for a siege that felt inevitable. The city's walls seemed to listen, each stone heavy with the memory of past wars, each shadow reminding citizens that empires do not forgive rebellion, they erase it. Despite despair, courage burned fiercely among the fighters. At Igani, Polish troops struck with unexpected ferocity, routing Russian forces in a stunning victory that sent shockwaves across the empire. A soldier exclaimed to his comrades, "We have broken the giant's teeth." For a brief moment, the impossible seemed within reach. Crowds in Warsaw cheered until their voices grew hoarse, believing that divine providence had blessed their cause. Yet commanders warned that such triumphs, while glorious, could not alter the balance forever. Russia had more armies waiting. Poland had only its sons and dwindling time. As battles dragged on, the strain deepened. Hunger spread through the ranks, uniforms tattered, weapons worn thin. In the countryside, peasants gave what little they could, yet famine loomed. Disease crept through makeshift camps, striking down men without a single shot fired. One dying conscript whispered to his friend, "Do not forget me, tell them I fought for Poland." His plea became a burden carried by survivors, a reminder that sacrifice was etched not only on the battlefield, but in every grave dug by weary hands. The cruelty of the Russian response grew sharper. Prisoners were executed without trial, villages erased from the map, and families driven into exile. Polish officers hardened themselves, swearing vengeance for every act of brutality. One captain told his men, "If they destroy our land, then let the ashes be our banner." His words spread like fire, binding men to the cause even as their bodies failed. The rebellion had become more than a fight for independence. It was now a struggle for memory itself, to prove that Poland would not vanish quietly under imperial boots. By late summer, the weight of exhaustion bore down on Warsaw. The walls trembled under constant threat, and morale wavered like a candle in the wind. Still, the rebels stood firm, knowing that retreat meant erasure. The storm gathered around the city, and with it came a silence heavier than thunder. The people whispered prayers, the soldiers sharpened bayonets, and all understood the truth that could not be spoken aloud. The final reckoning was coming, and with it, the test that would decide whether Poland's defiance would endure or be broken forever. By September 1831, Warsaw stood encircled, the final fortress of a rebellion that had dared to challenge the empire. General Paskevich gathered his Russian armies on every side, determined to bring the city to its knees. The thunder of artillery shook the walls daily, and the smoke of burning villages hung heavy in the air. Inside, the people braced themselves, aware that surrender meant humiliation, but resistance promised devastation. No one expected mercy. The only question left was how long Warsaw could endure before the storm consumed it. The defenders prepared with grim resolve. Barricades were reinforced, trenches dug deeper, and every able man pressed into service. Even children carried water and messages, while women worked in hospitals overflowing with the wounded. In council, commanders debated whether to attempt desperate sorties or conserve their strength for the siege. One officer declared, "Better to die striking than waiting behind walls." Another countered, "If Warsaw falls in one blow, Poland dies with it." The arguments revealed the same truth. There was no victory, only the manner of survival or defeat. The Russian bombardment began in earnest, shaking the city with relentless fury. Buildings crumbled under the weight of cannon fire, fires consumed neighborhoods, and the cries of the wounded echoed in the streets. Priests moved among the ruins, offering blessings to the dying, while soldiers fought to keep order. A woman clutching her son murmured, "The walls shake, but we will not." Her words spread among neighbors as a defiant hymn, a fragile hope clung to even as stones fell around them. The siege was not just military, it was psychological torment. Yet within the chaos, acts of heroism burned brightly. At one bastion, a handful of Polish fighters repelled repeated assaults, holding their ground against impossible odds. When their commander fell, a young soldier stepped forward shouting, "Poland still stands in us." Their defense inspired others, proving that courage could carve moments of glory even in despair. But every triumph bled away in casualties, each hero's sacrifice leaving another gap in the line. The Russians advanced slowly but surely, grinding Warsaw down with the patience of empire and the weight of numbers. Inside the capital, food dwindled, and disease spread unchecked. Starvation gnawed at civilians while soldiers rationed their last supplies. Leaders sent desperate appeals abroad, but silence was their only answer. France debated, Britain looked away, and Prussia feared Russia's wrath. The realization struck bitterly. Poland was alone. One rebel whispered to his comrade, "The world watches us die and still they do nothing." That sentence, repeated through the ranks, became a wound deeper than cannon fire, a betrayal that cut into the very heart of the uprising. By late September, the Russian forces breached the defenses, pouring into Warsaw's shattered streets. Fighting erupted from house to house, bayonets clashing in alleys, blood staining the cobblestones. Families barricaded doors, refusing to abandon their homes even as soldiers stormed through. The city screamed with defiance, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. When the guns finally quieted, Warsaw lay broken, its people shattered, its dream of freedom drowned in fire and steel. The uprising had reached its cruel climax, and the empire had imposed its vengeance without mercy. The guns fell silent, but Warsaw remained a city of ruins. Smoke curled above shattered roofs, streets lay littered with corpses, and the smell of fire and blood clung to every breath. Russian troops patrolled through neighborhoods once filled with life, now reduced to silence. For the survivors, defeat was not merely the loss of battle, but the erasure of dignity. Families searched among rubble for loved ones, priests buried the dead in hurried graves, and every stone seemed to whisper that the price of defiance had been collected in full. The vengeance of the empire was swift. Nicholas the Bastard ordered punishments that would crush not just armies, but the very spirit of the Polish nation. Executions were carried out in public squares, rebels shot before crowds forced to watch in silence. One condemned officer shouted before the volley, "Poland lives though I die!" His words were cut short by musket fire, but they echoed among those who trembled in the crowd, planting a seed that even bullets could not extinguish. Fear reigned, yet memory clung stubbornly to defiance. Deportations began almost immediately. Thousands were marched eastward toward Siberia, chained in columns that stretched for miles. Mothers were torn from children, husbands from wives, their cries swallowed by the clatter of boots on cobblestones. A Russian officer sneered at the prisoners, "You wanted freedom, now you will find it in the snow." The cruelty of the empire was deliberate, intended not only to punish the guilty but to terrify the living into submission. Warsaw wept as its sons and daughters disappeared into exile, never to return. The institutions of autonomy that once gave Poland a fragile voice were dismantled piece by piece. The Sejm was stripped of its power, schools placed under Russian oversight, and the Polish army dissolved entirely. Teachers were forced to replace their language with Russian in classrooms, and censors prowled through printing presses to erase even the memory of rebellion. One scholar whispered bitterly, "They fear our words more than our swords." The suppression was not only military but cultural, a systematic attempt to suffocate the nation itself. In villages and towns, the weight of defeat settled like an endless winter. Families who had lost sons received no recognition, only the demand for taxes to rebuild what the empire had destroyed. Priests preached endurance, telling congregations that God had not abandoned Poland, but eyes grew hollow and weary. A farmer spoke to his neighbor, "They burned my fields and call me disloyal. What is left for me but silence?" That silence spread, heavy and suffocating, yet beneath it, resentment smoldered, waiting for another chance to rise. By the year's end, the November Uprising was no longer a battle, but a memory of broken hopes and brutal consequences. Russia had imposed its will with iron and fire, stripping Poland of its autonomy and punishing it with ruthless efficiency. Yet even in defeat, the rebellion left an imprint too deep to erase. Songs were sung quietly in homes, diaries recorded forbidden truths, and children learned stories of sacrifice whispered by their elders. The empire believed it had silenced Poland, but in reality it had only buried embers that would burn again. The November Uprising had ended, but its echoes did not fade. Across Europe, newspapers reported the fall of Warsaw, some with sympathy, others with indifference. France spoke of bravery, Britain of stability, yet neither lifted a hand. In drawing rooms and parliaments, Poland became a tragic story rather than a living cause. For the Poles themselves, however, defeat was not a tale for others' pity. It was a wound carved into their identity, a scar that would remind them of chains every time they looked east. Among the survivors, stories of sacrifice became a hidden gospel. Families whispered the names of fallen sons at dinner tables, refusing to let memory be erased by decree. A mother told her child, "Your father died with Poland on his lips. Never forget." Such words carried more weight than any law, for they passed the rebellion into the blood of the next generation. Russia could bury bodies, but it could not bury the truth that Poland had dared to fight, even against impossible odds. Exile became another battlefield. Thousands who escaped or were expelled carried Poland's cause into foreign lands. In Paris, émigrés gathered to plot future uprisings, while poets turned grief into verses that inspired readers across Europe. One exile wrote in despair, "We left our homeland in chains, but we carry its spirit within us." His lament became a rallying cry among the diaspora, ensuring that even far from home, the fight continued. The rebellion had failed militarily, but it succeeded in planting seeds of unity across borders. At home, the empire's grip tightened further, yet resistance endured in subtle ways. Secret schools taught Polish history in whispers. Songs of rebellion were sung behind closed doors, and the Catholic Church became a vessel for national memory. A priest told his congregation, "The Tsar can command silence, but he cannot command your heart." His defiance mirrored the quiet rebellion lived daily by peasants and nobles alike. Though the empire believed it had destroyed the uprising, every prayer and song proved that its roots remained alive beneath the surface. The cost of the rebellion weighed heavily. Fields lay empty where farmers had fallen, villages scarred by fire, and Warsaw carried the scars of siege upon its stones. Some whispered that the sacrifice had been wasted, that defiance had only deepened chains. Yet others insisted the opposite, that without defiance, Poland would already be dead. A soldier who survived the fighting told his grandson years later, "We lost the war, but we proved we existed." In those words lived the true victory, identity preserved against annihilation. As decades passed, the memory of 1830 became more than history, it became prophecy. Every uprising that followed looked back to Warsaw's sacrifice. Every patriot drew strength from the martyrs who refused silence. The November Uprising had been crushed, but it had not been erased. Its legacy was not one of failure, but of defiance, of a people who chose suffering over submission. Empires rise and fall, but the memory of a nation's courage endures beyond cannons and crowns. In Poland's silence, Europe learned that defeat can still carry the weight of destiny.